The sterile white walls of the penthouse loft seemed to absorb all sound, trapping the agonizing silence inside like a vacuum. Daniel, barely 18 months old, lay in a custom-built crib that had cost David Miller $23,000, his eyes wide, unnervingly still. He hadn't swallowed a single solid bite in 7 full days, and even attempts to hydrate him with pediatric electrolyte solutions administered via a syringe had become a battle of exhausting futility. The little body, once robust and perpetually restless, was now heartbreakingly frail. The soft baby fat around his cheeks had recessed, carving hollows beneath his immense, silent blue eyes that seemed fixed on a point far beyond the meticulously designed ceiling. David, battalion chief of one of the city's busiest fire departments, a man accustomed to commanding respect and charging into infernos, found himself kneeling by that crib, reduced to a desperate, shaking wreck. His crisp uniform was rumpled, his face a map of stubble and exhaustion, the weight of the past 3 weeks crushing him far more effectively than any falling debris ever could. "Please, little man," he whispered, his voice catching. "Just a spoonful, for your old man. Don't do this to me, buddy. I need you here." David's world had detonated precisely 3 weeks and 2 days prior, when his wife Jennifer, a veteran paramedic who often rode shotgun on his calls, was killed during a 6-alarm warehouse blaze. She was retrieving a lost civilian when a section of the roof, the integrity of which David himself had misjudged minutes before, collapsed. The official report cleared him, labeling it a tragic, unforeseeable accident of the job. But David knew the truth lodged deep in his gut. His split-second command to secure the perimeter line, his focus on the main structural beam rather than the secondary annex where Jennifer had gone, his failure to account for every single contingency. It had been a fatal, catastrophic mistake. Now Daniel mirrored his father's guilt. The boy who had been Jennifer's absolute shadow, her constant joy, seemed to know instinctively that the man holding him was the reason his mother wasn't there to sing the evening lullaby. Daniel would not scream or cry or struggle violently. He would simply go utterly limp, his gaze turning inward, repulsed by the expensive silver spoon offered by his father's hand. The penthouse was a monument to David's success, bought with years of relentless, dangerous work and the accumulated wealth from their family's real estate ventures, yet it felt colder than a mausoleum. The refrigerator was stocked with organic, imported Swiss goat milk formula that cost $600 per case and tubs of pureed heirloom vegetables prepared by a celebrated private chef, all untouched, destined for the trash chute. His private nurse, Patricia, a stern woman with 20 years in pediatric care, stood back, her face etched with profound worry. "Chief Miller, you must try to rest. It is almost 4:30 in the morning. I have tried the chamomile sedative blend the clinic sent, and even the new feeding tube device is ready, but he simply won't open his mouth." David glared at the sterile, high-tech tube kit on the counter, its clinical presence an insulting symbol of his failure. "No tubes, Patricia. Not yet. The specialist said there is no physical blockage. He's just decided." He had brought in 3 different child psychologists, each charging an exorbitant hourly rate that would fund a working-class family's rent for months. The consensus was agonizing: severe grief-related trauma, complicated by the primary caregiver's sudden absence. The boy was grieving not just for his mother, but for the fundamental security she represented. They tried sound therapy, aromatherapy, introduced new, brightly colored sensory toys, everything recommended by cutting-edge medical science. All efforts were met with that terrifying blank stare. "We need to find a connection, David," the last psychologist, Dr. Miller, had advised just yesterday, his voice soft but firm, standing in David's library surrounded by shelves of fire safety codes and tactical guides. "He is mirroring your withdrawal. He needs a reason to fight, and that reason has to be visible in your desire to live." David had scoffed. How could he show life when every breath was a reminder of Jennifer's final, choked gasp? "I can buy him the whole world, doctor, but I can't buy him an appetite or his mother back." He felt trapped, his wealth suddenly a useless cage, a barrier between him and the only thing that mattered, his son's survival. Down in the city, outside the polished glass entrance of the skyscraper, Maria Davis pulled her worn cotton coat tighter against the pre-dawn chill. At 26, her hands, strong and calloused from years of cleaning, held a meager plastic bag containing her lunch, a small container of leftover rice and beans from the night before, A meal stretched thin to ensure her two younger siblings, still back in their tiny apartment in Queens, had enough for breakfast. She had taken 2 subway lines and a long, brisk walk to reach this affluent corner of Manhattan. This job, a one-time emergency fill-in for her friend Maria, different person in her mind, as per the original script structure, paid $400 cash for the day, more than she made in 3 full shifts at the diner she usually worked at. She couldn't afford to be late, couldn't afford a single misstep. "Just clean the main floor, no noise, no talk," her friend had emphasized over the phone. "The owner is an important, heartbroken man, and the baby is sick." Stepping out of the staff elevator into the gleaming marble foyer of the penthouse, Maria felt the familiar heavy weight of invisibility settle over her. She was met by Cynthia Ramirez, the house manager, a woman whose perfectly coiffed grey hair and cold eyes spoke volumes about the strict hierarchy of the home. Cynthia gave her a curt, dismissive assessment. "You are the replacement? Good. The rules are non-negotiable, miss. The first 2 floors are off limits, especially the nursery. Mr. Miller is distraught, and the baby is critically ill. You will use the staff pantry for your lunch and you will be silent. Is that clear?" Maria nodded, her face burning slightly despite her practice at ignoring such dismissiveness. "Yes, ma'am. Completely clear." She was given her cleaning caddy and pointed toward the massive kitchen and living areas. As she worked, meticulously polishing surfaces that already gleamed, Maria felt the oppressive atmosphere of the loft. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of something deeply, irrevocably broken. The opulence was blinding: $10,000 art pieces, silk rugs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. But everything lacked warmth. She saw photographs: a tall, imposing man, a beautiful, laughing woman in a uniform, and a joyful baby, Daniel, his smile a bright, magnetic force. In newer frames, the woman was absent, and the man looked like a ghost, his expression hollow. The narrative was starkly visible: loss. A deep, agonizing, life-altering loss that even millions could not cushion. She understood loss. Her own mother had died unexpectedly when Maria was 14, leaving her, the eldest, as the de facto parent. The memory of her younger brother, Raphael, refusing to talk or eat for a week after their mother's funeral, clinging to a threadbare security blanket, flashed in her mind. It was a trauma she knew intimately, a despair that the wealthy architects and doctors in this world seemed unable to treat. A faint, small, almost bird-like moan drifted down from the upper floor, the nursery. It was not a cry of demand or anger. It was a noise of pure, exhausted surrender. Maria froze, her dustcloth stilling on the glass tabletop. Her heart ached with a profound, instinctive sympathy that transcended the staff boundaries. Pobrecito, she thought, a common Spanish term for a poor, pitiable soul, the word an echo of her own past sorrow. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a small, defenseless life giving up. She was just the maid, the invisible helper. But the thought of that tiny, starving boy, surrounded by clinical perfection and untouched gourmet food, clawed at her conscience. She looked at the staff elevator, then up at the ceiling, wondering what kind of simple human comfort could break through that fortress of grief. She returned to her cleaning, pushing the thought back, but the ghostly moan seemed to linger in the chilled, silent air of the loft. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with a familiar, crushing tension. Cynthia Ramirez, the house manager, was making another desperate attempt to coax sustenance into the small, unresponsive figure of Daniel, perched precariously in his high-tech, ergonomically perfect feeding chair. The aroma in the air was an expensive mix of organic, pressure-cooked pheasant broth and pureed asparagus. Food so refined, it seemed to mock the child's primal refusal. "Come on, darling Daniel," Cynthia coaxed, her voice strained with fatigue. "This little spoonful cost more than the taxi ride downtown, sweetheart. It's packed with essential minerals. You simply must take one bite for Mommy, for Daddy." Daniel's response was the same chilling, passive resistance. He simply rotated his head slowly, deliberately away from the silver spoon, his eyes glued to the refrigerator door, which was currently plastered with his father's complex fire department schedules and safety inspection checklists. He didn't fuss or protest. He merely ceased to acknowledge the food's existence, a quiet, horrifying act of self-negation. Maria Davis, having finished the meticulously cleaning the granite countertops and now quietly wiping down the stainless steel hood, watched from the periphery of the vast kitchen. She saw the exhaustion on Cynthia's face, the defeated slump of the house manager's shoulders as she set the untouched $80 portion of food down on the counter with a heavy sigh. Cynthia retreated to the house phone, her voice dropping to a low, distressed murmur. "Chief Miller, it's Cynthia. He refused the afternoon feed again. The new prescription liquid vitamins, the formula, nothing." "Yes, Chief, I understand. But the baby hasn't had anything substantial in 7 days. I don't know what more to do." Even from across the room, Maria could hear the tremor of fear in the voice of the hardened house manager, and she knew the man on the other end of the line was wrestling with the same dread that shadowed them all. She pictured David, the imposing, authoritative firefighter, sitting impotently in his library, surrounded by documents that governed life and death for thousands, yet unable to save his own son. The injustice and the heartbreak were palpable, a suffocating force in the silent, immaculate kitchen. Maria's mind drifted back to her brother, Raphael, years ago. He hadn't been refusing organic vegetables. He had been refusing the cheap, starchy mashed potatoes she had tried to force on him after their mother's funeral. She hadn't had expensive supplements. She had had a small loaf of day-old Italian bread, the only thing they could afford from the corner bakery. Her abuela's words, learned in the dusty, sun-baked kitchen of their youth in the Dominican Republic, echoed in her memory. "A child who refuses to eat is not hungry, Maria. They are scared. They need the food that tastes like home, the food made with a quiet, certain hand. Not panic." A quiet certainty settled over Maria, a sense of conviction that pierced the thick wall of staff etiquette and the explicit warnings of Cynthia. She had seen this movie before, only the backdrop was now $20 million instead of faded wallpaper. The boy was suffering from an overload of anxiety and sterile perfection. He didn't need complicated food. He needed simple, unassuming comfort. Taking a deep breath, praying for a strength that was not her own, Maria straightened up, folded her cleaning cloth, and walked toward the immense professional baking station, the one used by the absent private chef. Cynthia looked up, her expression a mask of annoyed suspicion. "Miss Davis, what are you doing out of your designated area? You are finished with the stainless steel." Maria's voice was steady, infused with a calm she didn't entirely feel, but which felt necessary for the small, silent audience of the child. "With respect, ma'am, may I try something? Just one small thing. I saw your efforts, and I heard the chief's worry. I used to have a little brother who did the same thing when we lost our mother." Cynthia's eyebrows rose almost comically high, a mixture of offense and disbelief warring on her face. "You? Child, this boy has been attended by physicians from the city's finest private clinic, a team of specialized nutritionists, and you, the hourly cleaning help, believe you can perform some kind of miracle. It is absolutely out of the question." Maria didn't argue. She simply let her gaze rest briefly on Daniel. The boy, who had not looked at a single adult interaction all day, was now subtly looking at her. Not at her face, but at her hands, which she had purposefully placed on the large wooden breadboard. Ignoring the escalating fury of Cynthia, Maria reached into a seldom-used cabinet, pulling out a sack of unbleached flour, then found a small jar of good quality, but unassuming sea salt. She located a bottle of olive oil, not the infused, expensive kind, but a simple, robust California extra virgin, the kind her father, a mechanic, had always preferred for dipping bread. "It's not about the money, ma'am," Maria murmured, her focus entirely on her task. "It's about the feeling. They've been trying to feed him a cure. He needs a memory." She began to work quickly but deliberately, a silent ballet of simple ingredients. She mixed a small palm-sized portion of flour, water, yeast, and a little salt, kneading the dough not with the frantic energy of an overworked maid, but with the quiet, rhythmic assurance of a seasoned baker. The simple, earthy smell of rising yeast began to permeate the air, a scent utterly different from the clinical odors of the supplements and the exotic, complicated cooking. "Stop that immediately," Cynthia hissed, moving forward to physically intervene. "I will not risk my job. This is unacceptable. I will call Chief Miller right now. You are fired." But then, the unbelievable happened. Daniel, who had been a porcelain doll for a week, slowly, painstakingly, lifted his chin. His blue eyes, previously distant and haunted, tracked the movement of Maria's hands as they worked the dough. The boy's silence had been a weapon of grief. Now it was a state of rapt, fragile attention. He was observing the creation of something primal, something real. Ignoring the escalating fury of Cynthia, Maria continued. She slid the small rustic loaf into the convection oven, setting the timer. Cynthia stood frozen, her cell phone clutched in her hand, the threat of calling David dying in her throat. She, too, was watching the baby. The moment the small, perfectly browned loaf emerged from the oven, filling the vast space with the intoxicating, ancient smell of baked bread, Daniel let out a small, almost imperceptible sound, a breathy, single-syllable syllable, like a rusty hinge slowly turning. Maria took the hot bread, careful to wrap it in a clean cloth. She cut a modest, slightly charred end piece, tore it gently, and dipped the soft crumb into the simple olive oil, adding just the slightest pinch of salt. It was humble, simple, and smelled of the earth and comfort. She approached the feeding chair slowly, her movements unhurried, devoid of the pressure that had tainted every other attempt. She held the small, oil-kissed piece out, not to his mouth, but allowing the aroma to reach him naturally. "Daniel," she spoke his name for the first time, her voice low and melodic with a gentle, barely noticeable Spanish lilt. "This is just bread, the kind my grandmother used to make. It's strong food, for strong boys who have been through a lot. No pressure, little man." And then, in a moment that felt suspended between the impossible and the miraculous, Daniel reached out his tiny, emaciated hand, not to push the food away, but to take it. He brought the bread to his lips, chewed once, twice, hesitantly, and then swallowed. A profound shudder went through his small body, a return to life. Maria watched him, tears welling in her own eyes, but she did not press. She offered a second, smaller piece. Daniel took it, and the sound of his slow, deliberate chewing was louder than any thunderclap in that silent mansion. Cynthia let out a choked, tearful gasp. At that exact moment, the private elevator chimed, and David Miller, still wearing his soot-stained uniform shirt from the day's last incident, walked into the kitchen. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes trained to quickly assess emergency scenes, focusing instantly on the impossible sight. His son, his critically ill, starving son, was chewing on a piece of rustic bread held by the gentle hand of the maid he had never met. The sound of chewing was the loudest, most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "What is happening here?" David's voice was a ragged whisper, a man who had faced death 1,000 times, now facing the fragile, overwhelming presence of life. David's world, which for weeks had been defined by the crushing weight of grief and the cold, terrifying certainty of his son's decline, shattered and reformed in that instant. Standing in his multi-million-dollar kitchen, the overwhelming sight was not the city lights or the imported marble, but his son, Daniel, alive, chewing on a simple, oil-drenched crust of bread. David dropped the tactical helmet he was carrying. The dull clatter on the floor went unnoticed. He moved slowly toward Daniel, his powerful body, usually so decisive and swift, now moving with a terrible fragility, as if afraid to break the spell. Daniel, who had instinctively turned away from his father for 21 days, was still fixed on the bread, but when David drew near, the boy's head tilted slightly. His eyes, brighter now, met his father's gaze. "Papa," Daniel whispered, the syllable wet with olive oil and emotion, the first word he'd spoken clearly since before his mother, Jennifer's, death. It wasn't the distant, vacant stare of the past 3 weeks. It was an acknowledgement, a fragile thread of connection. David sank to his knees beside the high chair, his broad shoulders shaking, the tough battalion chief reduced to a heartbroken, grateful father. "My boy," he choked out, reaching a trembling hand toward Daniel's cheek, careful not to startle him. The boy leaned into the touch, a profound and silent absolution for the man who had been drowning in his own guilt. Cynthia Ramirez stood pale and shocked, the house manager's professionalism entirely overridden by the sheer human drama. Maria Davis, her hands now lightly dusted with flour and oil, stood back, a silent observer of the healing she had initiated. David turned to her, his red-rimmed eyes wide with a confusion as profound as his relief. What did you give him? What expensive foreign protein was that? The specialist tried everything." Maria shook her head gently. "It's just pan de aceite, Chief Miller. Bread with olive oil and a little salt. The most basic food. My grandmother taught me. When a child is heartbroken, they are not rejecting food. They are rejecting the fear that comes with it. They need food that feels safe. Food made without panic." Her simple explanation was a lightning bolt of realization for David. Every time he or Cynthia or Patricia had tried to feed Daniel, it had been an act charged with desperation, guilt, and the intense fear of death. The sterile, expensive foods had been administered like medicine, like a last resort. Maria's bread, however, was an offering of quiet, unburdened love, a taste of simple reality. You saved him," David stated, the words heavy with disbelief, looking at the simple maid who had succeeded where his vast fortune and specialized medical teams had failed. Maria, still humble, merely offered the boy a third small piece of bread. Daniel took it, his chewing now more confident, a tiny, determined sound of life reclaiming its territory. "He needed to know you were still here, Chief. Not just the grieving father, but the papa who still had love left to share. Children feel the anxiety in the air like a storm coming." David stood up, his gaze intense. He knew with absolute clarity that this woman had done more than just feed his son. She had broken the cycle of grief that was consuming them both. He dismissed a flustered Cynthia with a wave of his hand and turned to Maria. "I need you to stay, full-time. I need you to teach me. Not how to clean this house, but how to be a father who is present and calm, how to make that bread." Maria smiled, a genuinely warm, bright expression that momentarily banished the shadows in the kitchen. "I will stay, Chief Miller, but only if you promise me one thing. You have to eat too, and you have to sit with us. The healing for Daniel starts when he sees his father living, not just surviving." David looked at his son, who was now leaning back in the chair, a satisfied, sleepy look replacing the hollow despair. "I promise," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise we'll eat together, every day." Over the next 3 months, the Miller penthouse underwent a quiet, profound revolution. The sterile white walls began to absorb the sounds of life instead of silence. The library became David's office, yes, but the massive, formal dining room, the one with the 20-person mahogany table, was unceremoniously converted into a bright, chaotic playroom, covered in colorful rugs and simple wooden blocks. The heart of the home, however, was now undeniably the kitchen, where the large, imposing marble island was now frequently dusted with flour. David, the battalion chief, learned to knead dough. His massive, strong hands, which usually handled hoses and rescue equipment, now worked the warm, elastic dough with a surprising tenderness. He was awkward at first, struggling to maintain the correct consistency, always wanting to rush the process. But Maria, now called Tia Maria by Daniel, guided him patiently. "No rushing, Chief. The bread knows if you're hurried. Love needs time to rise." Daniel had transformed. He was now a robust, talkative, hilarious 2-year-old, his cheeks plump and rosy, his laughter filling the previously silent halls. He ate everything offered, but the papa bread with oil and salt remained his favorite, a powerful symbol of his return to life. The shared mealtime became a sacred ritual. David would sit next to Daniel's high chair, eating his own modest portion of pain d'assiette and simple soup, telling Daniel invented stories about a brave firefighter and his clever little boy. Daniel would often ask about his mother, Jennifer, not with grief but with simple, childlike curiosity. "Mama come back, Papa?" he would ask, his eyes searching. David had learned his new, honest reply. "Mama can't come back, my brave boy, but she is always here in our hearts. And she would be so proud to see us making the strongest food in the world, food made with love." One sunny Saturday morning, while David was showing Daniel how to safely add yeast to the flour, the little boy looked up at Maria, who was tying a small, brightly colored apron around his waist. "Tia Maria, you stay for always?" he asked, a question of immense, innocent importance. Maria and David exchanged a look, one filled with recognition, shared struggle, and deep, evolving affection. "Yes, my prince," Maria replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I will stay, as long as your papa and you need me." "I need you always," Daniel declared with the absolute certainty of a child who understands where his true safety lies. "Tia Maria is our family." David stepped forward, placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, and looked at his son, then at her. "He's right, Maria, you saved our family. You taught me that forgiveness doesn't come from a doctor or a ceremony. It comes from the smallest acts of presence. I was so focused on my guilt for the past, I almost missed the life I still had in the present." As the three of them kneaded the dough together, David's strong hands guiding Daniel's tiny ones, Maria's presence a grounding warmth, the house was no longer a symbol of tragedy and wealth, but a testament to an unconventional, rescued family. They had found that the simplest things, a small piece of bread, a shared meal, a quiet, loving presence, were the most powerful cures in the world. The man who was once Chief Miller master of the Inferno, had finally learned that his greatest strength lay not in saving others from fire, but in nurturing the fragile sacred flame of life in his own home.